All right, so I just want to take a quick minute here to show you guys kind of the inner workings of an HTTP request. This piece of software I have up in front of me is called HTTP Client, and it's a Mac-based software used to test and view HTTP requests and responses. So you have a couple different options here. Up here in the URL, we can type a URL just like any other. So let's try crdo.com. And then we have our method here, and this corresponds to those HTTP verbs I was talking about in the lecture slides. So in this instance, we want to use a get method because we want to ask crdo.com for its homepage and see what kind of response we get. So let's send this response. There we go. So as you can see down here below, we actually have the HTML that it returns. So this is the actual website itself that would display in the browser. And then above that, we have the actual HTTP response. And there's a couple things in here that you can check out just to get an idea about the response. So the first and foremost, the most important is this response code at the top. And 200 is an OK, so that means it worked OK. A lot of times you might see a 404. So for instance, if we tried 404.html, okay, there we go, a 404. I didn't think it would be that hard to actually get a 404 error. So here you can see up at the top, a 404 not found. So sometimes you'll see those on web pages, especially in in designy type web pages. They like to style their 404 pages nicely. And 404 just basically means the web server is responding to you and saying, hey, I can't find what you're looking for. Another response that you'll typically see, let me go back to this one here, is this 301 moved permanently. And what this means is that typically you'll see this when you try to request a subdomain that doesn't exist. And the most common or request or not request a subdomain where you're supposed to. The most common is the www in front of your domain. So Google actually requires you to type www.google.com. So that will actually get you a 200 error. That will get you a valid response. But if you remove the www and send that, you actually get a 301 moved permanently. Now, when you're viewing this in your browser, Google just redirects you to www.google.com. But if you actually inspect the HTTP header, you'll see that the server is sending back a 301, and it's telling you to go to www. Instead of just google.com. And this is important, especially when you're building and designing websites, because duplicate content is punished online. You never want to have two different web pages that display the exact same information. So what this does is this tells web browsers and also search engines to follow this redirect to the other website that we've moved this domain permanently to somewhere else. So these are what HTTP headers look like, and they have a bunch of different options. Below this, you'll see a link to a website that will give you all the different response codes and all of the different header elements that show up. And these become very important, especially if you're building APIs or doing development on the web. But they're also important it's also important to understand exactly what's kind of happening in the background when you actually make a request to a web server. And just so I can show you here, this is what the request actually looks like. It's very small. It's just the HTTP verb followed by the page you want, followed by the protocol, which in this case is HTTP 1.1. So for instance, if we were to say /jeff.html, which doesn't exist, you can see our request string changes, and the response, we still get the moved permanently. But again, if we were to put the www on there, we'd get 404 not found. The other cool thing you can do with this is kind of inspect what web server you're getting. So on my website, you can see right here the server is Nginx. This is actually hosted on Heroku, which we'll talk about later in the semester. But they use Nginx as their backend web server. And if this was an Apache site, so let's try TechCrunch and see what that is. Oh, TechCrunch uses Nginx. All right, let me see if I can find an Apache web server. Let's try the Huffington Post. There we go. So you can see Apache, the server is Apache right there. And down below, I'll get into a little more detail about what all these request parameters mean, or excuse me, response parameters mean. They're not entirely important right now, and some of them are self-explanatory. Some of them do actually help us make our websites faster using some of the caching mechanisms, but we'll get into that a little bit later on in the semester when we talk about performance. But for the most part, it's just important that you understand that requests to web servers and responses from web servers are stateless. They do not have state, meaning that the web server, every time you make a request, it's like you just met. It's like the web server has amnesia, and every time you go visit the web server, it has to remember who you are. So that's what I mean by stateless. And also that each response has this response code that helps the web server, or excuse me, that helps the browser or any other interface tell exactly what's going on. And then along with that comes the response, either an HTML file or an image or a CSS file or a collection of all of those things. So if you're on a Mac, I encourage you to check out HTTP Client and use it to kind of explore the web server responses and requests. And down below, I'll also post a similar Windows version of this, and even a website that you can go to mess around with HTTP responses.